Now, Tony Abbott was interesting this week on a couple of issues, carbon tax and industrial relations. We'll start with carbon tax. He says that the government is trying to booby-trap the legislation, and yet he will walk his way around those booby traps and he will rescind it in government, even if it takes a double dissolution election.
I think two things are becoming quite clear about his promise to get rid of the carbon tax. One is it will probably take 2 elections, so he'll have to go to the next election pretty much promising that there will be a double dissolution election unless Labor and the Greens give way and allow him to repeal the carbon tax. The second is that he's probably going to have to pay quite a lot of compensation to people who've already bought forward-dated carbon permits. I think when he talks about booby trap, he means that the legislation makes it clear that those things are property rights. Now, I think from the point of view of an investor, buying a property right, which is clearly a property right, and knowing that a government in the future can't take it away from you without compensation is probably a good thing, not a booby trap. But that's the way the coalition is seeing it. I think unpicking it is a massively complicated exercise, and the coalition is starting to realise just how complicated. And it was interesting this week that even the economist they often go to, Henry Ergas, wrote a column in The Australian basically saying, yes, these things are property rights, yes, compensation probably would have to be paid. So, the more they look at it, I think the more they're realising it's a blooming complex issue.
I mean, if an Abbott government is voted in, let's say in 2013, certainly there is a greater kind of unpicking job of quite new projects than you could. I mean, I can't think of a parallel.
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting that in so many ways what he's seeking is a negative mandate, a mandate to get rid of the carbon tax, to get rid of the mining tax, to make cuts to spending of which we don't know about yet. Much of what he's seeking election to do is to undo, to unpick. It's a negative mandate much more than a positive mandate today.
Well, ordinarily, if you go to an election promising another election, that would not be good politics. But in this case, he's judging, of course, that the carbon tax is so unpopular that if he makes that dramatic gesture and said, if that's what it takes, that's what I'll do.
Yeah, he wants to be able to say, he's assuming a landslide, of course. He wants to be able to say, look, I won big and they're not listening to you. We're going to go back to the polls again to send a message to them. Now, of course, it becomes very problematic. I got a very, very distinct recollection when Brian Harradine said, I cannot support the GST. John Howard's first instinct that day was, right, I'm going to call a double D, go on the GST again. And he thought about it over the weekend and said, there's no way I'm going back to the people a second time. Now, Tony Abbott would remember that moment, and they decided to take food out on the Monday. It took 2 weeks for them to do it, but on the Friday he said, definitely double D, and on the Monday they were talking the removal of food from the GST. So,
and even Kevin Rudd in early 2009 didn't go to an election either.
On the ETS, exactly. So, these things are very hard to call. I mean, the last one who kept calling elections every 2 years was Malcolm Fraser, and he basically burnt the Australian people out and created a, basically parted the seas for the biggest reformist government we've had in our history.